Thank you so much for being here again and joining us as we continue to think about the book of Acts. Today is our second to last time to spend some time in this setting at this time of year. I hope and pray that we'll return back to the book of Acts again at sometime in the future, but it won't be 2 Wednesdays from now. We'll be moving on to something else because we'll have finished the book. So tonight we're going to dive into a section that is, I think, a fairly well-known, popular section of the book of Acts, Paul's shipwreck and the subsequent activities that Paul undergoes on his way to Rome. So we'll be diving in here in just a moment to Acts chapter 27, but there's a couple of things that I've run across recently, and I'm sure one of them at least is in your minds as well, that is prescient for what we're talking about tonight. And so of course, it's been about 3 or 4 weeks now since the Dali struck the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, causing that bridge to collapse, right? But there you have an example of a shipwreck. Fortunately, only 6 lives were lost, which is amazing considering the magnitude of what took place. But we, of course, any loss of life due to a tragedy like that, we mourn, but the Dali is still stranded right where it struck the bridge there. And so 21 crew members of that ship are still stranded there, going about their day-to-day tasks on the ship, trying to make sure that the ship stays in as best of working order as it can under the circumstances while they clear the debris of that bridge. Of course, the entire port has been shut down, and it looks to be shut down for some period of time, or at least a very limited amount of activity going on in that port. And so even today, we still have these events where these shipwrecks can really affect people and really affect people's lives. And so Paul's shipwreck that we read about in Acts chapter 27 and 28 not only affects him, but it also affects all those others that were on board that ship. And so we're going to dive into this story tonight and think about it a little bit together. Some of you may have heard recently also about a book called The Wager. It's a story that took place in the mid-1700s of a story of a British ship, man-of-war ship, that shipwrecked off of the coast of Chile. And all of the members who were still surviving of that shipwreck had to figure out for 8 months how to live, how to sustain themselves on this island. And they went through the horrors of the shipwreck, but also the horrors of what comes after the shipwreck, of trying to figure out how to live when you don't have enough, when there's no provisions, when there's no order to how you live. And so they had to live through that. Amazingly, 30 or 40 people survived that shipwreck and made it back home, back to England eventually, several years later. And so we have an account of that shipwreck that took place. All of these remind me, Paul's story, the story of the Dali here just the last couple of weeks, the story of the Wager in the 1740s, they remind me that these events, this shipwreck, it's fascinating from the outside, but it's terrifying when you're involved in it. It's not something to be taken lightly. It's not something for us to look upon as outsiders and think how interesting, how exciting, how cool. It's something to look on and say how tragic and how unfortunate. And yet, tonight, as we continue to think about Paul and his story and the mission of God working through Paul, I think on the other end of it, we see that even through the tragedy that took place, God was still working and God was still up to something. So that's where we're heading tonight. That's where we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to think about, is what is God doing in the course of this shipwreck? Why is this a part of the story of Acts? Why is this a part of Paul's story? I find it fascinating. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that he has actually survived multiple shipwrecks. This is probably the most well-known story of Paul's shipwrecks, certainly the longest account of a shipwreck that we have of Paul. But when Paul wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it was before this shipwreck, and Paul tells us that he'd already had 3 shipwrecks that he had survived. So this would be his 4th shipwreck. It's amazing to think about that. I think I'd stop sailing. But that was one mode of transportation that was sometimes necessary in the ancient world. And even then was certainly a difficult mode of transportation. Even today, I'd say, is still at times a very difficult, dangerous mode of transportation. In Acts chapter 27, we find one of the lengthiest ancient accounts of nautical life, and it's really fascinating to read from that perspective of, okay, what did they have to understand, and what did they have to think about when it came to just setting sail on the Mediterranean Sea and things like that. And so Paul, this story of Paul that Luke writes for us contains quite a bit of information about what it would look like to do that, to go on one of these journeys. And so we have to think about those things as we read through this passage this week. I'm certainly not a sailor, and so a lot of it goes right over my head. I don't know if anybody in the room here tonight has any experience with anything like that. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read all of chapter 27 in one reading. It's a pretty lengthy reading. And there'll be parts of it that you might be tempted to think, this is kind of boring. And this seems a very different world, a very different thing to think about. But I encourage you, as we read it, to try to pay attention to the difficulty that these men would have as they're trying to set sail. And not only to sail, but they're also transporting prisoners. Not only Paul, but other prisoners as well. And so you not only have the dangers of the sea, but you also have the dangers of the company that you're in. You have the sailors and the soldiers and the prisoners on board this ship that is sailing. And so you have all these difficulties, all these dynamics at work, and how difficult it would be. So let's take a few minutes here together, and we'll read Acts chapter 27 in its entirety. And then when we do finish reading, I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion together, not just me, but include you guys as well, as far as what obstacles did they have to overcome as part of this journey. So you can pay attention to that as well. What obstacles did they face that had to be overcome during the course of this journey? So let's read together chapter 27, starting in verse 1. We'll read the entire chapter. It says, "When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, 'Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also.' But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the Northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.' So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. 'For the last 14 days, he said, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head.' After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Okay, kind of a long section of Scripture, right? Sometimes we're not so good in these settings at church of reading such a long section of Scripture. So I thank you for allowing me to read this story in its entirety here. But it's kind of a fascinating story. It begins a lot with the travel details. They're going from this place to this place. And thank you for those of you who gave me lots of grace on the pronunciation of those different places that they're going. So yeah, they're moving from this port to that port, and this person's getting on board, and this person's getting off, and a lot of those details. And then we begin to get into the journey. And I love how it begins. Paul, from the very beginning of the journey, a prisoner aboard this ship is trying to tell them how to sail. They're like, Paul, we're not listening to you. You're a prisoner. And so eventually, of course, what Paul says does come true. And so they face a lot of different difficulties along this journey, along this route that they have to take. And so I'm interested to see what stood out to you. What was one or two of the difficulties that Paul and the sailors and the soldiers and the rest of the prisoners, what did they face on this journey? What were some of the difficulties that stood out to you that we read about in this story?
Seasonal problems, the wind, the season of the year, they're not good, the northeaster coming in, so it's all weather related.
Yes. And certainly, as a sailor in the ancient world, you have to be well equipped not only with the knowledge of where you're sailing to know, okay, clearly they have some suspicions of sandbars and when they're going to run aground, and so they're running ropes under the ship for all those things. But they also have to know weather patterns and times of year that it's good to sail these different times. I looked up the distance from where they begin their journey in Caesarea and where they arrive in Rome. So of course we're not to Rome yet, but the total distance to get there is nearly 2,000 miles. that they're trying to travel here. And so that's a long stretch of ocean and land and ports to know those things, but then also to know about the weather patterns and when it's safe to sail and things like that. So yeah, they faced a lot of difficulty when it came to, they were at the wrong time of year. They were sailing in the wrong places. They had all of these things that came up against them, these obstacles related to that. So yes, thank you, Philip. What else? What other obstacles were there?
They were lost. If there was no sun and no stars, they had no idea where they were.
Yes. Yep, that's right. Yeah, so for 14 days, there's nothing but storm. And so they're fighting not only the storm, but they're also fighting not having the ability to navigate. And it says multiple times in there that they just have to let the ship go where the storm takes them, essentially, you know. They put down the anchors to try to slow down their progress, but yep, we're just gonna kind of let the anchors down and put the sails up, and where it takes us, it takes us. And hopefully the anchors will slow us down enough so that we don't find ourselves in some serious trouble there. So yeah, absolutely, thank you. What else? What other difficulties?
Makes me think a good sea captain could command a pretty good wage, because obviously the guy that was piloting this boat didn't know other than that. That you're so subject to the wind and the elements, as Phil was saying, to ignore them as they did would not be conducive to numerous voyages.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And then when Paul started in, you're all going to be safe. I've been his buddy, but I don't think I've got far from his side.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Wonderful. What else? Anything else?
Well, they really didn't want to sail very far. I don't remember how far it is from where they first were to go to that second place that they were aiming at. And it's all the same island. But they were uncomfortable at the first place. It didn't have the good comforts.
That's right. That's right. Mark, will you go? One of my last slides is a map. Will you find that for me? Just so this is kind of what we're looking at as far as their journey is concerned. I chose this one because I liked how it talked about the storm with the squiggly lines. So there was other versions that didn't have squiggly lines, and I like this one because it kind of tells you where they had some difficulty there. But yeah, so where Philip's talking about is they start down here in Caesarea, and so they're going from port to port, going around, and then when they get here is where Philip's talking about. They're on this side of Crete, and they're trying to get to Phoenix because they think that they'll be more comfortable. It's a better port to set out from after the winter. They're going to winter here, and then once the winter's over, they'll set out from there to continue on. But the storm picks up, and they can't make it back into that port, and they get drawn out into the open ocean. And then they eventually end up at Malta, where they run aground on the sandbar there. And so, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's the human element of this. That's a difficulty that they face, is the human element of where are we and where are we trying to get to, and where can I be comfortable as well.
They're also kind of struggling with hunger, right? It says bit of need, and then you have to wonder in the last bit where it's saying the centurions were wanting to kill the passengers or the prisoners for fear that they might get away. They're probably more thinking, hey, we're going to be hungry and thirsty. It'd be a lot easier if we didn't have to take care of these stupid prisoners.
Yes.
We can just get rid of them and we'll save ourselves a whole lot of headache.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Man, this pops up in these stories of shipwrecks, plane wrecks, right? There's not enough provisions to make its way around, and so how are we going to prioritize who gets what? And then the more time goes on, you get into even the further dangers and the horrors of, okay, well, what are we going to do to survive if we absolutely have to as well? And those can be some very dark conversations and dark moments in history when you start looking at those different events like that. But yeah, hunger was the one that I was keying in on myself because I enjoy food. So that was pretty quick. It says that they throw the tackle overboard. They're throwing all their supplies overboard, and so they're going hungry here for a couple weeks at a time and trying to combat this storm. And it's not like they get sufficient rest while they're combating this storm. This is a constant. It's not like you get 8 hours of sleep in the middle of a storm when you're sailing, and so they're battling fatigue and hunger and things like that as well.
There had to be sickness too.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Makes me sick.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and you know, I mentioned that there's the book that I mentioned about the wager earlier, and that that's something that all through history that people have struggled with, right? Scurvy. Until, I mean, it's just been recent that people figured out what the cause of scurvy is, right? And so you're on this ship and you're wasting away and dying, and the solution is quite simple, but you don't have access to the solution on board a ship, right? And so not only scurvy, but other diseases and things like that that you have to deal with too. Anything else? Any other difficulties or obstacles that they faced along this journey?
The sailors wanted to abandon ship.
Yes.
I don't know where they were going.
Yep. The sailors nearly absconded with the lifeboat, and they nearly took off, leaving the soldiers and the prisoners to their own, you know, just whatever fate was going to befall them. The soldiers put a stop to that, and so everybody was able to survive. And of course, Paul speaks up and says, if you leave, you won't survive, and we will somehow. I don't know how that was going to happen, but God would have made a way for it to happen.
At the point they ran ropes around the ship, put it together, I might have got a little nervous.
That's right. That's right.
I've never heard of that. I've never been guessed.
Yeah. To hold the ship together, we're going to pass some ropes around. And I wonder how they did it too, right? Because it's, yeah, I guess so. In the middle of that storm, they're diving into the water and carrying ropes underneath, yeah. Well, it should be fairly obvious, but there's, in the heart of this section of text that we read, when Paul speaks up, he says some things that are very vital and important to this chapter. So I want to reread those again. This is in chapter 27, verse 22 and following, because this is the heart, I think, of what's going on, and something that we need to pay close attention to is what Paul says to the people. He says, "Now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" So Paul speaks up, and he's got a bit of good news and a bit of bad news here. The good news, you're going to survive. The bad news, we're going to lose the ship. And so we're going to have to deal with what happens then. But the good news is that you will survive. And so he begins to speak to them about his God, and he tells them that it is because of the message that he has received from God that he has confidence and that he has trust that they'll make it through. So I don't know what the response. Luke doesn't record the response of the sailors to this. We don't know if some of them were so desperate that, hey, any news, any God, if any God is going to show up and save us and protect us, I'm on board. That may have been the perspective of some. Others may have looked around and said, how can you talk about God when we're in the midst of this? 14 days, not enough food, this storm that is threatening to destroy our ship and kill us. How can you say there's a God at a time like this? You know, that might have been the response of some. Others may have blown Paul off as a lunatic. He's a prisoner, after all. And so, you know, they already have shown that they're not willing to listen to him once earlier in the story, and so why listen to him now? I don't know what the response of the different people on board this ship are. But what I do notice and what I do appreciate is that when Paul speaks up in a few more verses and says it's time to eat some food so that we can gain some strength because the moment is upon us, what do? They eat. So it's my hope that at least some of them were willing to listen to Paul as he spoke about this God that he serves and this God in whom he had his trust. And so Paul takes this opportunity. This shouldn't surprise us about Paul, right? That he takes an opportunity to share his faith and his trust in God with the people that he's surrounded by. But Paul does so, and maybe some of these men speak up, or maybe they hear him speak up and they listen. And so 276 of them, 275 others plus Paul, are on this ship. They're in this together, and Paul does encourage them to eat. And I wanted to draw this out as well as we thought about this chapter together. In verse 35, when Paul tells them to eat, I just want you to pay attention to the language that he uses. It says, after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all, and then he broke it and began to eat. This is almost a formula of how meals get spoken of in the New Testament. I think of when Jesus feeds the 5,000. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and then they begin to feed the 5,000. I think of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples. Jesus says, this is my body and this is my blood shed for you. And he breaks the bread and shares this meal with them. So look at Matthew 26, where Jesus is having that last meal. And he says, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. So Paul's not celebrating the Last Supper here on board this ship. He's not celebrating the communion meal. But notice how communion-like it is. And I think that's important, because I think Paul has this view, this almost that heaven and earth are commingling together, and that there's this closeness between the two. And certainly at a moment like this, where your life isn't hanging in the balance, you're on this ship and it looks like you're headed for disaster, Paul wants to draw out this theme of God is closer than we think. Some of them may have been thinking that there is no God. How could there be a God? And Paul's perspective and how he encourages them to eat is this: God is nearby, God is close. It's just like as if Jesus is having this meal with his disciples. It's just like when Jesus fed the 5,000. It's just like these events. God is right here. He's among us. He's with us. Let's eat this meal. It's not going to be our last meal, but let's eat this meal. And he does so in a very Eucharistic kind of way, if that makes sense. He has this view of God that I think allows him to take this meal aboard this ship in a way that reminds him of Jesus. And he incorporates others. They don't even know it. They don't know the story of the 5,000. They don't know the story of the Last Supper. But yet he incorporates them into this very Eucharistic type of meal where they're not celebrating the Lord's Supper, but it's like the Lord's Supper, if that makes sense. And so they share this meal together, and Paul continues to be faithful to God even in the midst of these difficult circumstances. All the obstacles that we just talked about, all the difficulties that they faced, Paul is confident in God, and he keeps his trust in God. And so the truth is that even if one person is faithful to God and willing to listen to the Great Commission that Jesus has left with us, that God will respond in faith as well to us. They run aground on this island, Malta. And we're going to read one more section together here tonight. But they run aground on this island, Malta, and they don't know what's going to happen next. But Paul has confidence, and Paul has trust in God. That even in the midst of a storm that lasted for 14 days where it looked like there was no hope, even when we shipwreck and we don't know what's coming next, God is still good. And so let's take this food, let's eat this meal together. And it's a very Eucharistic kind of meal. Okay, so they're going to travel nearly 2,000 miles. Mark, if you'd put that map back up there again. They're going to travel nearly 2,000 miles to get to Rome. And at the end of chapter 27, they shipwreck onto this island of Malta. It's a tiny little island, right? You see it there. It's real small. And they don't know what they're going to encounter. And they don't know what's going to come next. And they don't know if there's going to be any form of salvation there. But we find out at the beginning of chapter 28 that there are people there who are willing to show unusual kindness to Paul and to the other shipwreck survivors. So let's pick up the story in chapter 28. Let's read about what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, the danger is not quite over yet, but there is some good still yet to come from this encounter on the island of Malta. 28 verse 1. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people, expecting him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island, and he welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. Okay, so Paul's not out of the woods yet. He's got a little bit of difficulty ahead of him, but I want to draw out for just a minute or two here as we close tonight, the response of these islanders to Paul and to his companions, these shipwreck survivors. Because they basically go through 3 different stages of response, specifically to Paul. And the first one is what we read in that very first verse, this posture of unusual kindness. Now, we don't know much about these islanders from Luke's account. We don't know much about who they were, but I can imagine that if you were suddenly to see 276 rough-looking, dirty, smelly sailors, soldiers, prisoners wash up onto the shore, there'd be potential for lots of different reactions to such a crowd. You certainly could be afraid of them because you've got some prisoners in the mix. Life at sea is a hard life, and so even the sailors, you don't know exactly what kind of person you're getting with the sailors. You've certainly got some Roman soldiers in the mix, and Roman soldiers are no one to be trifled with. And so I wouldn't put it past somebody to see this group of 276, even if they're weak and struggling, to look at them and say, I better keep my distance. But instead, they show unusual kindness to them. They build a fire. They begin to help provide for them. By the end of it, they provide them all the supplies that they'll need to complete their journey to get from Malta to Rome. And so they begin by showing unusual kindness. I think that's a good lesson for us in today's world. More and more, it seems like the natural response to others, quote unquote, the other in our world, the one who's different than you are, the one who has a different nationality, a different background, a different experience, a different story, whatever it is, whatever the difference is between you and that other person, it seems like we're being encouraged more and more to respond to that person from a stance of fear and distance. But the reaction of these islanders to Paul and these shipwreck survivors is one of hospitality and unusual kindness. They're not followers of Jesus, and yet I think in some ways they've understood something about human nature, that we're meant to have connection with each other, and that we're meant to show kindness to one another, even if we have differences, even if one's a Roman soldier and one's an islander on this tiny little island of Malta that maybe has never seen any other part of the world besides this tiny island. There's this commonality between their humanity that, okay, I'm going to help you survive. I'm going to build you a fire. I'm going to help provide for some of your needs. So I think that's a good example to us, to remember that when the world urges us to view others with suspicion or fear, that there's opportunity for us to show unusual kindness. Anybody in here ever was taught, or you taught others to practice random acts of kindness? Right? That's kind of like what this is, right? It's this moment of kindness to shine through, that we have the commonality of being human and being made by God. And so rather than looking at people automatically with fear and suspicion, it's okay, how can I unusually be kind to this person? How can I do a random service for them? But as they're doing this random service for Paul, he's dropping some firewood, some brush onto the fire, and out of the fire comes a viper. Because of who I am, I automatically assume that this was a big snake. This was a deadly snake. I'm not a big fan of snakes. Anybody in the room like snakes? Okay, good. You all are my people. That's good. If you like snakes, you can keep it to yourself. I just assume that this is like the biggest, baddest, gnarliest snake that you can imagine. And everybody's expecting Paul to die. I mean, this was not just some little tiny guy, This was something that at least looked threatening. That they said, oh, Paul's in for it. He's a goner. And so they're waiting around, and as they're waiting, they're like, he survived a shipwreck, but he gets bitten by a snake. This guy can't be a good guy. And so they think he's a murderer. So he goes from somebody that they're showing unusual kindness to now he's a murderer. The progression is quite phenomenal. Paul washes up on shore and, poor guy. We pity Paul. But all of a sudden that snake latches onto his hand and they think, this guy's a murderer. He goes from being pitied to being prosecuted just because the snake is driven out of the fire and latches onto him. Paul shakes it off and he goes back into the fire, I assume to die, I hope to die. And Paul survives. And so he goes from pitied to being prosecuted to now being praised. He must be a god. He survived this snake attack. And so they view him in three different ways: as a stranger to whom they need to show kindness, as an enemy, a murderer, he's a prisoner, he's clearly a bad guy, and now to a God who's to be praised. I imagine, probably not many of us in the room, have an encounter with somebody else where we either leave that encounter thinking that they're a God or that they leave that encounter thinking that we're a God. But this kind of spans the spectrum of different ways that we can view one another. We can view people as strangers to whom we should be kind and courteous. Others can be enemies to us, or they can be people that we celebrate, that we're fans of, that we're friends of. So it kind of spans that entire spectrum of different ways that we can view others and that they can view us. But as we think about this story, and as we think about the story of Acts, I think it's important to think about how are we going to respond to others when we view them in one of those three categories. And maybe more importantly, how are we going to respond to others when they see us in one of those three categories? Are we a stranger that we can be courteous towards one another? And if we're a stranger with somebody, how are we going to respond to them in that instance? If we're an enemy to somebody, if they don't like us for some reason, we have a bad history, a bad moment, there's something that keeps us apart from one another, how are we going to respond in that time? And to those who we're close with, those that we have kinship and friendship with, how are we going to react to those people in our lives? I think Paul's example, not just in this story, but as we've tracked it all the way through the book of Acts that we've been reading, Paul always, in any of those instances, was kind of consistent in how he treated others. They were people with whom he wanted to share the gospel. People that were strangers to him, that he didn't have strong relationships with. How can I respond to them by sharing the gospel with them? People that were enemies to him. Well, how can I respond to those people by telling them the story of Jesus? And the people who were his friends and his close confidants, how can I ensure that those people in my life remember the story of Jesus? That's what I want to encourage us to think about tonight as we leave this story, as we think about what is the end of the book of Acts trying to get us to think about. How are we going to be consistent with others in our lives? No matter how they view us, we could be an enemy to somebody, we could be a friend to somebody. How am I going to consistently share with that person the hope that I have in Jesus? How am I going to share the gospel story of salvation with them? How am I going to present the story of Jesus no matter what kind of relationship I have with somebody? I think Paul is remarkably consistent that's always something that is at the very core of who his identity is once he meets Jesus on that Damascus road. From that moment forward, he wants people to meet Jesus the way he has met Jesus. And so he's always looking for that opportunity to share with them that. Now, I do want to mention at the end of Acts 28 here that they view him as a god. And we don't get to really hear much of the interaction there, but we already know from an earlier story that people at another point in time viewed Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14 as gods. And we know in that story that Paul spoke up and kind of talked them down a little bit. He tore his clothes and as a symbol of repentance and hey, I'm just a human being just like you. I'm not a god. But he took that opportunity, I'm sure, to tell them about the God that he serves, just as he did on the ship with those sailors and soldiers and other prisoners. And so as we close out tonight, as we leave this story and as we think about what it is to be a follower of Jesus in light of this story in Acts 27 and 28, I hope that we'll think of how are we going to let others know through our lives, through our words, who Jesus is. I think that was the main thing that Paul cared about in his life. How will others know Jesus because of me? And so we're getting close to the end of the book of Acts here. We've got one more night to study in the book of Acts before we finish the book. And Paul's headed to Rome. And he's headed to a court to hear his fate, perhaps to be heard by Caesar himself. The vision that he receives here in chapter 27 says that he's got to stand trial before Caesar himself. And so I imagine that Paul, on the island of Malta, as small and as out of the way and insignificant as that is, and in the court of Caesar in the heart of Rome, Paul is thinking, in either case, no matter what case, how can I tell the story of Jesus? How can I help others know who he is through my words and through my life? So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do as followers of Jesus too. How can we let others know who he is because of us? Final comments. We're out of time, but any other comments from these stories in chapter 27 and the beginning of chapter 28? Okay. Let's close with a word of prayer, and then I'll dismiss us, and we can go on. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your words in Scripture, God. What an amazing story that has been handed down to us generation after generation. And God, we're just so grateful to know about these events that happened to Paul and in his life. God, we're challenged by Paul. We're encouraged by Paul. Sometimes we wonder how he did it, God. How could he continue to be faithful to you under all these different circumstances, through all these different events? But God, tonight we just pray that his example and others' examples, the followers that have come before us, and ultimately the example of Jesus, that these would touch our hearts and touch our lives, that we would try to honor you and try to honor Jesus in all that we do by sharing your word, by sharing your message, by always being willing to give an answer for the hope that we have because of you. And so, God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to gather together. God, we know that there are many in our congregation that need our prayers, that need our attention, our compassion. And so, God, we just pray that you'd be with each and every one of them. God, for those who have been dealing with illnesses and sicknesses recently that are improving, we're so grateful, and we continue to pray for their health. We continue to pray that they would grow strong. And God, we're just grateful for the good news that we've been hearing recently. And God, for those who are still struggling, those who are still having hard times or dealing with different things in their lives, God, we just pray that your love and compassion would be upon them, that your peace and healing would be upon them. God, for this congregation, as we continue to go through a transition process and as we're seeking your will as to who our next preaching minister will be, God, we just pray that you would be with us, be with each member of this church, be with our elders and our search committee. God, we just pray that this church would have a bright future, not because of who any of us are, but because of who you are, and that we can be faithful to you. God, we pray as we go from here tonight that we would be your willing hands and feet in this community, in our homes, in our jobs, wherever we find ourselves, God. Give us opportunities to be your people, and help us to see those opportunities and to seize them and to do all that we can to help share your name in this world. We thank you for Christ, and it's in his mighty and powerful and precious name that we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you.